Pleasure for me to welcome you all wherever you are at this fourth session of our AI Tech and Policy Talks, AITPT. And for those of you who join us for the first time, let me indicate that AITPT is an initiative of our Digital Law Center that has the mission to present and discuss cutting-edge issues dealing with multiple aspects of AI tech and policy. And today, it's a great pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Robin Geiss, who is Professor of International Law and Security at the University of Glasgow. And Professor Geiss is clearly not a foreigner for our University of Geneva. He has indeed very close connection with our university, also because he's the Swiss chair of International Humanitarian Law at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, which is a joint academy between our University of Geneva and the Graduate Institute. And it is furthermore a very special privilege and honor to welcome Professor Geiss today, given that he has just been appointed by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres as the new director of the Geneva-based UN Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, on which I want to warmly congratulate him, and which is also a great news because that means, as he just told us, that he will move to Geneva, which will certainly create further opportunities for interaction. Professor Geiss will make a presentation today on the very important topic, AI and the digital battlefield, and we'll discuss various aspects of the role of AI and technologies in today's and tomorrow's warfare. And as done for the previous session of AITPT, the presentation by our speaker will be followed by comments that shall be made by two distinguished commentators. And today our two commentators are Professor Giovanna Di Marzo, who is the director of the Computer Science Center at our University of Geneva, and Professor Marco Sassoli, professor at our law school in the Department of Public International Law and International Organization. And then we will open up the floor for discussion with our speakers and our commentators, and everyone here is welcome to join in this discussion. Please note that the session is recorded so that it will be made available online for future reference for those of you who have not been in a position to join us today. And let me now, without further ado, wish you all a very stimulating AITPT session. And let me now give the virtual floor to Professor Robin Geiss for his presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Jack, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for having me at the Digital Law Center today. The timing of the event is perfect. You might have seen that the United States National Commission on AI only yesterday they published a 700-page report, which really sends a fervent message for the US to invest more in artificial intelligence, including in defense and military contexts. So I think the timing here is perfect. AI, excuse me, AI on the digital battlefield, that's the topic for today. And let me start by looking at the title. I've deliberately chosen not just to speak of AI in military contexts or lethal autonomous weapon systems. That's really where most of the attention has been, but to shift the focus a little bit on the digital battlefield, because by that I really mean to say that it's not only artificial intelligence. Increasingly, it's various digital technologies operating together, being interlinked, whether it's cyber capabilities and AI, sensor systems getting smaller and getting better, or robotic platforms. And all of this taken together, I think we should be looking at it holistically. So far, the debates have been somewhat in isolation. We have a huge cyber debate, obviously. We have a lethal autonomous weapons debate, but increasingly, I think we need to recognize the merger of all these technologies. I think we should not only be concerned with human control about a given weapon system that operates autonomously, we need to maintain human control overall over digital battlefield processes. And I think that's the first message I wanted to send just by way of choosing this title. The second is, I think, when talking about AI in military contexts, we should first start by recognizing the many possibilities for the better that are also inherent in the technology. I think it makes no sense whatsoever to take a technology averse approach to all of this, because then we will not be making any progress. So I think it's important from the outset to recognize the possibilities that AI entails. Just think of the beautiful pictures you've seen of planet Mars in recent days, the Perseverance robotic platform that is now operating on Mars. That's certainly one of the benefits, and shows that science really is magic that works at the end of the day. So just wanted to say that at the outset, because as a lawyer, of course, I am concerned with the risks entailed in this technology and with possible regulatory approaches and constraints that we might need to impose. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. And it should really come to no surprise that in a military context, we need to discuss certain risks and legal constraints. Just think of, risky applications of AI in civilian contexts for medical purposes, in surgery, self-driving cars. There are risks, there are ethical questions that are complex and challenging. And so really, it should be no surprise that if we're discussing weapon systems or military applications in a broader sense, that there are challenges as well that may need regulation. So I think I've been given 20 minutes, and ideally they should feel like 10. And I have 4 topics that I wanted to raise, really just to inspire our discussion. I'll be going about in fairly broad brushstrokes here, and then we can certainly go deeper when we get to the discussions. So first of all, lethal autonomous weapon systems, killer robots, as they've also been called, the most visible and most palpable form of AI mounted on a robotic platform. That's really what kind of makes it physical. And this is, I think, also why this is where most of the attention so far has been. These systems, they're really the tip of the iceberg. They've been discussed for over 7 years, including at the United Nations and among states. I think here we know what most of the challenges are. And there are, I think, 3 principal legal, ethical domains that we need to discuss. Can an autonomous robot system, weapon system, comply with IHL? I don't know. I think that's also due to speculation to some degree, how technology will develop. It will depend on where such a system is employed. Is it a complex environment or a simple environment? I think there's no straightforward answer whether these systems can abide by IHL and comply with regulations. But I know what the law is telling us. They can only be deployed if it is clear and guaranteed that they can respect international humanitarian laws. To me, that's really not the most challenging question. The answer is fairly straightforward, I think. There are, secondly, that's the other domain that's being discussed, accountability challenges, no doubt. Under the legal framework as it currently stands, it's not always straightforward to establish accountability for something that an autonomous system has done. If something goes wrong, there is an accident, an autonomous weapon system targets a civilian, even though it wasn't meant to do that. How do we allocate responsibility? That can be challenging, but there's no conceptual theoretical barrier to accountability in all of this. You may have heard of the accountability gap. That is an issue, but it's not an insurmountable issue. Responsibility is a legal construct, and if we want to ascribe responsibility, we can legally do that if only we want to, and if we get states to agree to do it. That's the hard part here, clearly. The biggest concern, I think, with autonomous weapon systems is human control. The question of human control, whether it needs to be maintained, and why and how. Of course, if we're talking about fully autonomous weapon systems, then it's somehow anachronistic to speak about human control, because once you have human control, they're no longer fully autonomous. And that really goes to the heart of the problem here. The strategic promise that comes with AI and robotic systems is that they can bring things up to machine speed. And the more you bring in human control, the more you drag it back down to human speed. And that's really, at the end of the day, I think, the debate that we're having. I think the good news is that we have widespread agreement among states, scientists, other fora, that we need some degree of meaningful human control. Where the debate currently is, where the contestations are, is what that really means. To some observers, that means manual, full kind of kill switch control over the system, so that a human being at any point in the deployment could turn the system off. But that's full-fledged human kind of control and brings everything back down to human speed, because you as a human being need to be able to monitor what's going on, and you can intervene at any stage. Clearly, this is no longer machine speed to which many military players try to aspire with these systems. The other end is a much looser kind of form of human control, regulatory control. You oblige developers to implement certain safeguards from the start, but it's far away and far removed from any idea of a kill switch or manual control. Sorry, that's the spectrum really of views that are out there. And somewhere along the spectrum is probably room for compromise. I think at the end of the day, human control will require a tiered approach that takes into consideration the context in which these systems operate. It's much more problematic, much more high risk if there's human beings in the vicinity, whether civilians or combatants. It's probably ethically, legally easier if they operate in outer space, for example. An autonomous satellite engaging another autonomously operating satellite. Many of the ethical concerns that go back to human dignity, whether a machine should be making life and death decisions, they're not at stake if it's only machine to machine constellations that we're discussing. So I think human control will have to be a tiered and dynamic concept at the end of the day, and hopefully states will be able to make some progress along these lines. That was my first kind of strand along AI that I wanted to discuss, the tip of the iceberg. Now, the kind of the bottom of the iceberg is the big picture and the much bigger picture. It's not robotic systems, but it is the use of artificial intelligence for military decision-making writ large and on a broad scale. AI is an all-purpose technology, very much like electricity. It will become increasingly relevant at all stages of decision-making, human decision-making, civilian or military. But as far as the military is concerned, and this is our concern today, of course, there is a wide range of decisions, for logistical purposes, transportation, that are unproblematic, where the laws of war don't raise any particular concerns. I also don't see many ethical concerns there, or none whatsoever. But of course, there are also more critical decisions in the targeting cycle, when it's about target identification, whom to attack, what to attack, when to attack, how do you deal with collateral damage. If these kind of critical decisions were to be handed over to increasingly AI-supported decision-making. So it's not a robot targeting someone, it is still human beings pulling the trigger, if you want, but the decision is informed on the basis of AI-generated information. AI tells you, well, this person, according to what was programmed into me, is a target. This person is someone that under military rules and the laws of war, you can legitimately attack. If that decision is made by artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence can pull all the relevant information together, can make fast and accurate and very precise decisions here, then that is probably an issue also of human control, but also an issue given that AI has always certain problems. And again, these problems are not exclusive to military decision-making. It's problematic to employ AI in various forms of decision-making. Why? Because there can be bias. The programmers who program the system, they will make certain trade-offs, and that will affect outcomes of the system. There is the so-called black box problem. We know what the input into an AI-driven system is, and we know what the output is, but we don't always necessarily know how the system arrived at a given decision. There's therefore intransparency to a certain degree that can lead to moral diffusion, lack of accountability. The bias can also develop on the basis of poor data that is fed into the system, or the system is trained on poor or biased, unconsciously biased data. We've already seen experiments in social media where quickly AI-driven systems picked up racist slurs and so on. So certainly there's risk and things can go wrong. And that needs to be taken into consideration also across the broad spectrum of military decision-making, that in the future, whether we like it or not, will increasingly be informed, augmented, or replaced by AI-driven decision-making. And I think that at the end of the day is the far bigger issue, because it affects all domains of military decision-making, whom to detain, whether a given area is a high-risk area, considered as a high-risk area and treated as such, who will be targeted. I think that's something that requires more attention. And also, I think regulatory approaches, in the first instance, not necessarily legally binding, but awareness-raising approaches to the problems inherent in any type of AI-driven decision. Now, I came from the tip of the iceberg. Now I went to the kind of the main part of the iceberg. Now let's go underground for a moment, because at the heart of all this and what's driving AI capabilities at the end of the day is data. Without data, you cannot bring AI's processing power to bear. That only makes sense if you have a lot of data to process. That's really when you win, if you can rely on AI. Also, in order to train AI systems, you need large amounts of data to even develop capable systems. What that means to me, I think, is that in the future, reconnaissance and data collection in times of war will become ever more relevant. As armed conflicts and the battlefield is digitalizing, the hunger for data and data acquisition in times of armed conflict will only grow exponentially. I mean, it's always been huge, but the pressure to collect all the data will be even greater in the future. And just to give you an idea what that could mean on a digitalized battlefield, I'll tell you about a historic military operation, Operation Igloo White. That was an operation where there were air-delivered, air-dropped sensors. They were spread out in the jungle, seismic sensors, acoustic sensors, olfactory sensors out of all, to track and monitor what was happening in a given part of the jungle. Now, I find that instructive, this example, because it's from the Vietnam War and from the late 1960s. So if you were able to drop thousands of sensors into the jungle to monitor the Ho Chi Minh Trail at the end of the day in the late 1960s, then we can only imagine what may be possible and what a full take on data may look like in future conflict theaters. Unmanned small systems that can, have cameras mounted onto them, all kinds of sensors. The sensors have become smaller, more powerful. Batteries are small. The lifetime of these systems is long. So you can only kind of imagine what a full take on data in future battlefield environments might be. And what worries me to a degree is that under the law as it currently stands, data protection is not really an issue in times of war. And it's probably anathema to most observers. And there are reasons for this. Of course, you need to be able to survey areas in times of armed conflict, and it's probably illusionary to think of any limits there. But at the same time, I would raise the question for our discussion whether data can go entirely unprotected, whether privacy really has no meaning in future conflict settings. I think there we need to start having a discussion whether some form of baseline protection when it comes to data is in the 21st century is not also required in times of armed conflict. And I'm aware that's a stretch and it probably won't happen tomorrow. I'm aware that we could rely on human rights law, but really I'm not sure how strong that protection would be in reality in contemporary conflicts. So data protection in times of armed conflict for me is an increasingly relevant but underexplored area, highly contentious, no doubt, but I think it requires attention and discussion. And my last point that I wanted to make is about information warfare, because information warfare, that's really where cyber capabilities and AI capabilities increasingly come together. We're all aware about the misinformation campaigns that have happened over the past years, public opinion manipulation, also now in the context of the pandemic, election manipulation. It's not only in cyberspace the technical layers that can be manipulated. I think increasingly we've become aware that the social fabric and social layers can also be manipulated, and that restoring social cohesion can be far more difficult than repairing a cyber-enabled system technically. And AI will be a very relevant factor in this, especially when we're talking about really large-scale armed conflict distortions of the information space. So, I mean, all the misinformation campaigns so far that we've been discussing, they've mostly occurred in times of peace. But just imagine what I mean, militarily capable players could do in times of war if they really wanted to distort content layers, the news environment in Switzerland. You know, for AI-driven systems on a large scale, it's probably not very problematic to rewrite all the newspaper articles that appear today. So you could really distort the media landscape, and you could undermine public trust in a given country fairly quickly and on a very large scale, and that can be very destructive. The problem that I have here, again, is that I think traditionally we have not really considered this to be an issue in times of war. The first victim of war is truce. You probably have heard that. Propaganda, of course, is legal in times of war, and misinformation campaigns are part and parcel of warfare planning. But I think in the 21st century, that might need to be reconsidered, just considering how damaging AI-driven new cyber capabilities could be. If you take into consideration deep fakes, visual content can be faked, audio content can be faked. I could be faked just now and you would not necessarily know it. And if you do that on a large scale, you can really undermine public trust. And as a consequence of this, really cause damage also to the functioning of societies. So again, for further discussion, I would like to raise that the protection of public information spaces, a baseline protection of public information spaces as such, so that you cannot corrode them entirely, that certain content layers remain protected, even in times of armed conflict. That's another point I would like to raise for discussion. It's contentious, not straightforward. I'm very aware of this. I'm also aware that we must not overload, for example, the laws of armed conflict. They're only meant to provide baseline and not perfect protection. But still, in the 21st century, I think not thinking about these issues, not thinking about public information space, digital information space protection at all in times of conflict also misses an important aspect of how military operations might unfold in the 21st century. I'll leave it here, Jack, and I look forward to the comments and the discussion. Thanks very much. Up to you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating and very, very interesting presentation. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Di Marzo. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Robin, for this very inspired talk, and also for the papers you shared with us before. I will try to provide some further information about the discussion, mostly from my computer science background, let's say. So first, I will pick up on the autonomous weapons, then a bit on the data protection in time of war, and I will finish with the misinformation. So just to give you some more information about what I know is going on in the domain. So for the autonomous software, actually the definitions, or autonomous software is around since a long time, and it means that it's a software capable of having sensing capabilities, so seeing, hearing, or more, and acting, and proactive decisions, and taking also decisions and initiatives, and of course taking autonomous actions. So the main point of this autonomous system, as has been said, is that we want them to work without human supervision, because they have to operate in some places or in some situations where human let's say supervision is not possible, or too complex for a human to deal with all the information. And also maybe sometimes we want them to go in unforeseen situations, like those that go in outer space. So they have to be equipped with some capability to adapt, to change their behavior, and to take new decisions. So even the code has to be a bit specific so that it can do this type of things. And we have, in fact, also in everyday today, this type of autonomous system. We have now also intelligent assistants that help us with our task and that prompt us to different things. And so they have a good side, and they have, of course, a bad side, depending on how we use them. So what I wanted to also mention is that, that there are different ways of developing them. So you have some years ago an IBM proposal called Autonomic Computing, where there was an analogy with the nervous system, and the global system of computers would work on their own and do most of the main basic tasks without the human being necessary, like self-repairing, self-protecting themselves, self-optimizing, or self-configuring. And also there is another way of seeing it, which is a bit different, which was more bio-inspired system working like swarms and having nice capabilities of adaptation. So here you can imagine swarms of robots, not necessarily harmful ones, but that can organize their work. So of course, the main point, as has been also mentioned before, is this trade-off between control and autonomy, because this is by definition a contradictory notion. We want to control the system, but at the same time, as computer scientists, we want to give them the maximum autonomy so that they can overcome any type of situation that can arise, they can take decisions that had not been anticipated. And but at the same time, as normally in any software, we should also always, as a human, just retain control. And a simple example, which has nothing to do with autonomy, just even automated systems, there are more and more now buildings that are automated or intelligent buildings, and then you have not the possibility to open the windows because there is air conditioning, and also because the blinds go up and down on their own. And it's very frustrating just to be there and you cannot control even the blinds. So, I mean, control is very important. This example is very simple, and it's even more crucial when the system has to do very different tasks, which are not just shading the light. So the point is that it's very important to retain the control, and it's not easy in the sense that this must be provided since the design of the system. We have to provide kind of direct hooks so that we can go and tell the system now stop everything, or we have to divert its behavior in a way or in another depending on how they have been developed. And so if we go back to the idea of the swarms of robots, how do you tell a whole swarm of robots to come back and to convince them that you are the legitimate controller of this swarm of robots, on who, on the other side, you give the possibility to go around to observe things and to make any type of actions. So this is, I mean, there are research on that point. It's not completely satisfactory, but there are research. But this is an issue, and this is a clearly important point. And this is also linked with another basic issue with this AI or software, is that whatever the software we develop, even an innocuous software that makes accounting or anything else, there is this issue that the program must be correct, must be safe, must function well. And in principle, we have nice software engineering techniques to do this, but in practice, every software has bugs and has problems. And so it remains, the issue is even more crucial for autonomous weapon systems, because you also have, these are safety critical systems that should not harm who they should not, and they should not do wrong things. So, and this is without the problem of, I don't know how they do this in defense department, but in usual software companies, softwares are always or regularly insufficiently tested, made in a hurry, and because they have to be released, they have to be available. And so this puts an additional pressure on the result, I would say. And on another note, so there was in the papers I read from Professor Geiss, there was this idea that contrarily to a human soldier, a robot has not the capability to doubt or has no emotions or cannot recognize emotions in civilians, for instance. And here I just wanted to point out that it's still research, but it could be possible to equip some software with ethical rules or moral rules. And I always was a bit interested in looking at this, but at the same time was wondering whose ethical or whose moral codes are we injecting in the software? Is it the software developer or is it the client who ordered the software? And I found some hints in Robin's paper about humanitarian law obligations. So maybe there is a possibility there to include this type of policies, let's say, in the software. And so the software could abide or should abide to these policies. And so it's inside. And just to go back for emotions and consciousness, there are some recent works also done here at the University of Geneva about equipping autonomous system with a conscience. And so I don't know if this is something can help the discussion, because at the same time, yeah, we want to use weapons, but we want to equip them with consciousness. I don't know if that's not conflicting, but anyway, if we want to go along that route, there are works from psychologists that aim at developing computational models of consciousness. And this could be applied to any type of software. And there are preliminary results with little robots. And so that was for the part of the autonomous weapons. So just briefly, the 2 points on the information warfare. So there are also here research about how empowering citizens and users about this misinformation. So here we also have a PhD student working on the idea that we should not, we could provide a system where data or information is a post on a social media is kind of certified, in the sense that there is a whole community behind that can give its opinion. So it could be expert, but it also could be you and me, anybody could give his opinion about what they think. And so we could imagine a future where instead of just being receiving this information, we should receive only, or we should have an information about how certified this information is. And on a similar note, maybe we could also work on educating people. Independently of war or military issues, we also receive a lot of images from publicity, advertisements that are also fake. And then there is a whole issue about teenagers wanting to look similar to what they see in these pictures. And maybe if we had a better eye to see this, we could also be more critical with other misinformation. And finally, about data protection in armed conflict. Here I just wanted to, maybe raise the point that I think it's important to protect data in armed conflict, even more than in when there is no conflict. And maybe we should also think about the fact that whatever the data it is we protect or we don't protect, or we allow not to protect, the point is that in AI we can cross data together. So this means that maybe individually the data look innocuous, but when we bring them together, then something is revealed about some sensitive information, and that could also be something to think about. So I think I will stop here with my comments.
Thank you very much for all these comments. There's definitely a lot of food for thought. Quick reaction from my side before giving the opportunity to Robin Geiss to perhaps react to the comments. What I just wanted to say, which I think very interesting, is what you said, Giovanna, in terms of introducing human control by design, which obviously rings a bell when we think about the perhaps neighboring concept of privacy by design, to see how we should structure software products in a way that shall make it possible somehow, in a way, of course, to be further defined and to have that adequate level of human control. That's one quick note. And the other is about what you said in terms of somehow the unsafety of software and the fact that there are bugs that somehow also led me to think about another, let's say, weakness of software and technology in general, which is the fact that they are exposed to cyber attacks. So even if they are, I mean, as a matter of principle, bug-free, so to say, they can still be attacked in the course of cyber attacks, which may also raise additional challenges if third parties take over the control of autonomous weapons. So just to confirm, as we all know, that there are obviously plenty of different aspects that should ideally be taken into account. But I shall stop here and give back the floor to Robin, Geiss, if you want to react to that before we shall come to our second commentator.
Yeah, just briefly, if I may, I don't want to take up too much space here. Giovanna, thank you very much. I mean, what I have found most difficult, and I've been, I think, over a decade in these discussions about new tech, is really merging the legal layer with the technological expertise, and really having interactive dialogues is one of the greatest challenges in all of this, because we all have our own jargons and so on. But I found what you said very, very instructive. Also, just to follow on what Jacques said about safety in software, inherent issues with bugs and so on. Not just in, I mean, in a conflict setting, militarized setting, it's not only that this could be attacked, there's also just adversarial conduct that really may be very unexpected. And the adversary may not be doing things according to plan. And that, of course, will also challenge the software and how it interacts with its environment. At the same time, I would also acknowledge, and it's great that you made these points, Giovanna, that you called it, you know, programming ethical rules, some form of conscience, whatever the right word there may be. I agree. And I also think, you know, conservative programming could go a long way. We often approach these systems on the basis of they have to abide by the same rules that we have for human beings. But the rules that were designed for human beings, they also took into consideration that humans will be, you know, under a threat for their life in a battlefield context. And there's only so much you can ask of them in such an high-risk environment. That's different for machines, and machines could be programmed much more conservatively. So in a situation where a human being might be allowed to resort to lethal force, why should the same be true for a machine that can be armored and where there is no risk to human life? If you know, we cannot maybe ask the most accurate collateral damage assessment of a human being in the heat of the moment under battlefield conditions, but we can certainly do that for a machine that's operating there. We can ask the machine to double check or triple check and then check again before ever engaging in any kind of lethal conduct. So I think this conservative programming, whether it's really a conscience or just conservative kind of narrow rules, could be ways to get around some of the problems. So, I mean, again, I would underline that I do think we need a constructive approach, because I think states will be pushing forward. The geopolitical implications in all of this are so strong. And I think the recent report from the US, but other players think exactly the same, just underlines how technology will be driven forward here. And therefore, we also need to take these, I mean, constructive approaches into consideration. So thank you for highlighting that. No, I'll leave it there. I really liked how you used blinds going up and down as an example, because that reminds me what a sunny place Geneva is. And coming from, you know, Glasgow, Scotland, where we have 25 different words for rain, I, again, really look forward. And I see the sunshine outside the window over there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, including for the nice words about Geneva. Let me now give the floor to our second commentator, Professor Marco Sassoli. Marco, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jacques. Thank you, Robin. This was very interesting. You didn't make my work easy, because somehow, how can one disagree with you? But it is very important what you said, that we have to have a wider look. I will comment just as a lawyer, as a humanitarian law person. But we agree that on the first two issues you mentioned, there is existing law. And the question is simply, how do we apply this existing law, or should we revise this existing law, as you suggest, by saying it has to be more conservative if a machine acts? I have some doubts there, simply because at the end, the law is anyway about human beings, and the machine is only a means, and therefore behind it there's always about a human being. I mean, a machine cannot have a right to self-defense. A machine is an object, and there are rules whether and under what conditions you may protect an object, but obviously these rules are for the use of force more conservative. Now, the two other issues, data protection and information warfare, as you rightly say, largely international humanitarian law, at least when it comes to conduct of hostilities, because obviously when people are in the power of a party, there are rules on that. We don't have rules. It will be difficult to agree on rules. Also, just for the public to see what information warfare, well, China would say to give information about what they would call alleged labor camps of Uyghurs is information warfare, and therefore they would like to have a treaty which prohibits me to say this in peacetime and even more in wartime. Now, I agree that somehow lethal autonomous weapon systems are the tip of the iceberg, and everyone agrees, and I have always doubts when everyone agrees on this concept of meaningful human control. Some people say about the critical decisions. The decisive question is, what are the critical decisions? Obviously, there must be control about whether force is used, potentially lethal force is used, but about against whom, this would simply bring us back, which would be a good thing, because I'm against war, and I would say, let's not make war. Let's rather try to solve problems peacefully. But IHL is about war and tries to bring a minimum of humanity in a very inhumane situation. And there, okay, in the Middle Ages, there were these knights who were fighting against each other, or the samurai in Japan, okay. But even in the First World War and even Napoleon, when there is artillery, the one who triggers the shot does not take a decision of conscience. Do I want to kill this person, or do I want to kill this person? And so all the remarks about humans are able to exercise mercy, well, with a weapon which, at least until now, is not prohibited, an exocet missile. It's about 1,000 kilometers. Well, the one who triggers, we hope, respects IHL and therefore uses it only against military objectives, but who will be the incidentally killed civilians, he or she does not know. So the idea life or death decisions must be taken by human beings does not really say anything, in my view. And I must say that therefore many of the ethical and legal arguments made in the debate, if taken to a logical conclusion, exclude many, if not most, of collective weapons existing today. And they also idealize human soldiers. You know, when I hear that programming creates bias, well, perhaps I'm simply, you have always to see the observer standpoint. You know, I fortunately was never confronted to artificial intelligence in armed conflict, but to human beings. And these human beings, nearly all of them had a bias in an armed conflict. And I, at that time, as an ICSC delegate, had to try to negotiate with them. And also, obviously, machines can make mistakes, there can be bugs, but perhaps it's because I have a German car, my car makes much less mistakes than I do. So what, in my view, is a crucial question, and there perhaps Mrs. Di Marzo can help us, in my view, is the predictability, limitability element. I understand the black box problem. So it is, for instance, that the Google car driving from Geneva to Lausanne, we will not know where it will drive through, but we must be able to know that it will stop at the red light and at pedestrian crossing if a pedestrian shows up. And we cannot give this an artificial system, both for lethal autonomous weapon system, but also for the use of AI for military decision making, somehow the latitude which is given, and here I become nearly in the faculty of theology, somehow to human beings, because at least what I learned in catechism is that our Creator decided to give us the possibility to violate the rules he or she wanted us to respect. And this is only possible because we have a conscience, and machines in this sense have no conscience, and therefore it must be possible, and I don't know whether it is, and what I read, people are very vague on this, to make sure that the artificial intelligence can never decide not to comply with the rules it was programmed to comply. Obviously, it's not artificial intelligence if it cannot develop its own understanding and decision-making progress, but somehow that there are limits which the machine, except if there's a bug or hacking, and this is an important point, obviously, will not change. And I think rules, again, are necessarily addressed to humans, and a machine, even within the artificial intelligence, remains an object, but perhaps I have a very anthropocentric attitude. A last remark on data. Data collection is obviously also very desirable from an international humanitarian law point of view, and I think we should make simply sure that when artificial intelligence is used for military decision making, it is not only used to collect data about the possible targets, but also say about these civilians who can be incidentally affected. And that would be an incredible progress. I mean, and it is already used in part for this purpose. Somehow to have plenty of information how these civilians will react to certain things, whether then everyone will flee to the bridge, which I want to attack next. Well, I think these were some of my thoughts. Again, I think the human control is a part of alibi or simply an empty term for the time being. What, in my view, is very crucial is this predictability, limitability element. But here, I must say, I'm optimistic because all these systems, or most of them, are used by military. And in my experience, military are obsessed by control. So the military would never like to have a system which they cannot control. And this is understandable because, I mean, if the artificial intelligence comes to the conclusion that the most efficient solution is to attack their own forces, the commander is ruined. And therefore, somehow, not for humanitarian reasons, but for military reasons, I think the military will make sure that there are limits to the artificial intelligence of such systems. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marco, for your thoughts and comments, including the one, I guess, on which we could perhaps start first about the fact that human control is an alibi. I'm sure Robin Geiss may want to react to that and to other points, and perhaps Giovanna, to whom you actually referred, Marco may also want to react on that. Robin, would you like to start?
Sure, yes, with pleasure. Marco, thanks very much. Very inspiring as always. I tend to agree. You could look at human control as just an alibi for. It's an alibi for many things. For a ban discussion, it's an alibi for other things. But I would prefer to look at it constructively, because I think what you mentioned about predictability, limitability, the known unknowns in Rumsfeldian terms that are inherent in the black box that AI represents, I think that can all. Human control can also be a notion that brings us closer to controlling the issues that arise from unpredictability in particular. And human control, as I said, should be interpreted dynamically, and it should not be understood as manual full control, I think. But it should lead us to reflect on where we can tolerate certain failure rates and certain unpredictability. I don't mind so much if a submarine autonomous system, no humans involved, just a machine operates against another autonomous sea mine, let's say. Failure rates is not top of my list, maybe, if this doesn't endanger any human beings. But in an urban setting, failure rates is a different kettle of fish. And I think there, our tolerance level for any failure would be much reduced. And I think, given that human control has become the term of art, so to say, in diplomatic discussions, it can be a useful carrier, at least, for these types of discussions. And so I wouldn't abandon it. What I do agree with is that we tend to idealize the human soldiers, certainly. That goes again back to failure rates. The approach to autonomous weapon systems is kind of, it must be a 0% failure rate, which is unattainable. And therefore, I think maybe there we're putting the bar too high. Again, I would differentiate different contexts to assess different failure rates that can be tolerated, and not over-idealize the human soldier as if they had never failed. So I do agree on this. And I also agree on this, fighting at no risk. We've seen that for many years, where high altitude bombing, distance artillery uses. We have many weapon systems where the person executing the order, pulling the trigger, is far removed from the heat of battle, under no risk to his or her own life at the moment of the attack, and where also the person does not know all the exact circumstances of what is actually going to happen 500 miles away on impact. So there are issues, and I do agree that some of the arguments in the AI and autonomous weapons debate, if they were taken to their logical consequence, that would cause problems with many of the existing systems, and underlines also why many states are not kind of favorable of these discussions. What you said about, of course, censorship, information warfare, yes, I agree. But just because there are risks in discussing information warfare and imposing certain limits cannot prevent us from having that discussion, because there are risks on both sides. It could be abuse for increasing censorship on the one hand, yes. But what I have in mind is I still think more attention needs to be given what military capable players could do, what kind of damage they could do to the information environment if they really full scale engaged in corroding and distorting it. If they really rewrote the content layers of the Tribune de Genève and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung and everything to confuse the population of Switzerland deeply and over a sustained period of time. And this could certainly be done. And I'm not just talking about some fake kind of pictures or videos on YouTube. I'm really talking about corroding the information space at large. And military players, if they wanted to, could do this, and they could probably achieve strategic aims by doing this. And there, I think if that was to be done systematically, nationwide on that scale, I mean, we must start talking about some kind of constraint. And I think narrowing it down in that way can keep it apart from other important debates about censorship, which obviously we do not want to endorse by having this on conflict focused debate. And then on data collection, I really like your point, Marco, that yes, data collection also has good sides. As I was saying, we should always appreciate the possibilities that come with new technologies. More accurate decision making is certainly something that's beneficial also for the application of IHL. I agree, a very good way forward would be to say, well, if you do collect data, you also need to take the protective angle into consideration, not just the targeting focus. And as I said, I don't think it would be realistic to impose any limitations on data collection in armed conflict. But what I am concerned about is usages of data, including when the conflict is over. If you have a full take on, the city of Geneva, everything that's happening, all life patterns, and that will be possible in the future. With small systems that can monitor every street and every front door of every house, they will know when someone has left and came back and so on. I mean, really, this can be a very thorough and deep-reaching monitoring of life patterns. And that can be useful for more accurate targeting, can be useful for better protection and implementation of the laws of war. But there are privacy and data protection issues that extend also beyond the conflict. And so in which way can you use this data? Can you use it in blackmail scenarios, for example? I don't think so. I think we should discuss whether that should be allowed. What about biometric, the most sensitive data? Surely in armed conflict, you will want to acquire this, because with facial recognition, you can then also target much more accurately than you probably could in the past. But biometric data is the most sensitive of all. It stays for the entire lifetime of a person. So if we allow a full take data collection on biometric data of all kind, how do we protect it when the conflict is over? What usages do we allow? How is this, if all of this is publicized? If a party to an armed conflict decided, well, we want to let the world know what the people of Geneva are doing, we're going to make it all public. There are huge issues involved here that I think we need to discuss as data appetite and collection increases in conflict settings. I'll leave it here, Chuck. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Robin. Giovanna, would you like to react to what has just been said?
Yes, so first to what Marco said about the black box. So it's true that for some type of AI, especially those with neural network, there is a kind of internal circuitry in the AI logic, which makes it very hard or impossible to determine how the system comes up with some decision. But then this is linked with also what you mentioned about predictability. We must make sure that the autonomous vehicle is going to stop before the pedestrian. And then this is more linked to other aspects like the verification. So now that we have trained our black box, we have also to verify we have trained it properly, and then that the decisions are in line with what we expect. But this is also linked to what Robin said. There are cases where in 98% of the cases, the decision is right. And there are other cases where the decision is wrong, either because we made false positive, so we think we found the pedestrian, so we stop and there is no pedestrian, or false negative in the sense that, okay, we think there is not a pedestrian, and then we go there. And so that's something that people develop this AI system are pushing these, let's say, levels of right decision to be the highest possible. But again, it's not 100%. And there are always cases that have not been foreseen. So I would say that's for maybe clarifying the black box and the predictability and verification. For the limitability, I found this interesting. I'm not sure if I understood the way you wanted it, but I think a software may know its limits, or at least as developer, we may know the limits of the software. And here I wanted to give 2 examples. In bio-inspired AI systems, we usually use bio-inspired techniques. So for instance, we have swarm of robots foraging, like the techniques used by ants, for instance, or by other type of insects. And so here we know that this type of way of working is very good to adapt to specific changes in the environment, but completely fails to overcome other changes in the environment. So we know the limit. And otherwise, we can also equip our system with the limit. So in a much more simpler example, we now sometimes you have already possibly interacted with conversational agents, or more simply said, chatbots. And sometimes the chatbot refers to a whole database behind, but maybe the question you ask, he cannot understand it, or he cannot answer. So he will, if the chatbot is well developed with a nice personality, which is another aspect besides emotion, we can give personality to this autonomous system. So then the chatbot can nicely say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you said, or I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to this question. So I would say, yeah, the limit is an interesting concept, and it is also being investigated. And maybe an answer to Robin. Yes, so about the rules, or the moral rules, or whatever we want to give also to the machines, and that the machines, yeah, I agree that the rules can be adapted to the machines, because I was more thinking in terms of general moral codes to put in the machines, but somehow the machines also have to protect their own integrity, because if they think too much, they may be just disintegrated by some bomb or something. So they are not human, so they are not alive. They don't need to react about their life, but somehow they have to think maybe, or they have to be careful about their integrity. It's like without robots, it's like a system that tries to protect itself from attack, from cybersecurity attack, and identifies automatically, autonomously, here there is an attack, and how can I respond to the attack, just in networking, cyber security. So yeah, just a thought on this.
Thanks very much, Giovanna. Marco, would you like to react, as you somehow initiated this part of the discussion, or Robin? Marco?
No, yes, just to understand the issue of limitability. Obviously, everything you mentioned is important, but the crucial point for me, which I still do not understand, but my feeling is it must be possible, is whether even a system which has the artificial intelligence, I can make sure, except technical failure or hacking, that the system will not use its intelligence to take a decision which is outside the limits the programmer has put to the system, that the system somehow, the programmer says, within these limits, like a little child in our park, you may be around and use your artificial intelligence within these limits, but you can't decide, as a human being may, to go outside the rules you were told to comply. Obviously, there can be failures, there can be hacking, but is it possible, if everything works well, that to make that sure, or is it inherent in artificial intelligence that you cannot guarantee this?
Okay, I think I can answer. Yes, so it all depends on what you want the system to do. So I think you can program the system so that if at some point he is in a situation where it has not been instructed about what to do, it will just do nothing. So I mean, I think you can do that in terms of instructing the system that it has to take decisions on whatever it has been instructed to do. And I think that's possible. But the other case is also possible. You may also want to program the system so that he has to take decision outside the limit of what we told him, because he is on its own and he has to find out what to do. If you think about the outer space missions, they are on their own. Nobody's there to help. And so they have to take also decision outside the limit of what has been programmed. But to go back to your concern, which is restricting more the box, I think, yes, you have to, but you have to program it. You have to make sure, yeah, it's possible. Of course, then guarantee is always subjected to a verification and what we said before, so bugs and so on, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's now time to open up the floor for discussion and perhaps questions or comments by our participants. So given that we have set up the session in a way where it's possible for you to speak, I would invite those of you who would like to make a comment or ask a question to please do so by taking the virtual floor, or also by using the chat if this is more convenient to you. If for some reason you cannot speak, perhaps because you're in a library or another silent space. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, Jennifer.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Well, good evening from where I am, actually. So hello, everybody, and thank you for sending the invites to all alumni of the University of Geneva. I actually was in the summer school for intellectual property, and I do have a lot of questions, but please forgive me first and foremost for being not much of an expert in this subject. My knowledge is based on what I have just read online, and it's not as extensive probably as yours. But a few comments. Again, thank you to the speakers. I've learned so much, some things that I didn't even think about in this discussion. First and foremost, it was pointed out that one of the dangers of having an AI capability in a battlefield is that there's a possibility of corruption. We all know that because of the cybersecurity, and there's a hacking issue. Now the question for me here is that, has it been considered that this could devolve around the idea that the one who has the most money will probably win? It sounds very offensive and tactless. I'm so sorry, but I think that's one of the things that we should think about, because look at it this way: hackers they're not really the ones, the best ones that I know. I don't know of, I don't know them, but I've heard about. They're not exactly the ones a government would hire. I mean, most of them are underground hackers. Let's be honest about these. As those who make the best viruses and bugs are the ones who are testing it out for fun, or who are paid to do it. So is that a consideration that we should definitely think about when creating this law? The idea that these AIs could be corrupted by outside forces, not just the military players that were discussed by the professors. Professor Geiss, for instance, said military players, but what about those third parties that are not military players but have a financial interest in these things? And I'm so
Perhaps,
sorry.
Jennifer, perhaps we can revert to Robin Geiss, and he may want, or as well as Marco Sassoli or Jabanatim also react on that. And then we can perhaps move on if there are no other questions or comments to be made. Robin?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to chip in, and I don't think it's a taboo to mention money, which plays a big part in all of this. You know, what also plays a big part is, I think, that we're seeing a militarization, let's see, of science and of the economy more broadly. And I think that'll also play into this. And I don't know, you know, the underground hackers, I'm not so sure. I mean, there's very capable criminal actors, and they're very good at monetizing computers and data. Ransomware attacks, that's really the bulk of what we've seen in peacetime criminal activity, and a steep rise in the past 2 years on this. But probably the most capable players are the big tech players in terms of knowledge, technological advance, science, investments, and so on. Now, I don't think they pose a danger. I mean, not in the sense that criminal underground hackers would, but of course they will play a much greater role than private actors have in terms of arms control, in terms of military affairs in the future. And it's a whole new ball game, I think, given the capabilities that they have. And how we bring them into these debates, into the ambit of the various legal issues that we're discussing, that's really a challenge that lies ahead. You know, I mean, states traditionally like to keep to themselves in these high stake security debates. When it comes to digital technologies, I'm not sure that's still feasible, at least not in all of the domains that we're discussing. So that's, I think, the big issue. The underground hackers, they're obviously a huge problem in terms of law enforcement and criminal activity and the damage they cause, especially to the economy and the financial sectors. But I've also, I think, over the past 20 years or past 15 years, states really have resumed their sovereignty and their capabilities in cyberspace. And, you know, it's no longer, I think, the bearded kind of garage hacker that it's really leading. You know, I would not underestimate, and this is why I've been pointing out the military capabilities that we haven't really seen unfold. I mean, we see a lot of malicious cyber activity, but I'm not sure we're really up to speed on what powerful military players, big states, how much they've invested into science and human resource and tools and what they would be capable of doing. And that's one point I keep coming back to, because we have not really seen cyber or AI being used on any large significant scale in any battlefield conditions. The suffering that we're currently discussing, the main issues are Syria and Yemen. This is, you know, traditional, very crude weapon systems, not cyber attacks that cause suffering in Yemen. So we haven't really seen what military big players are capable of, but I would certainly say, given the interest in these topics, given the defense budgets that they've allocated to this, I would not underestimate what they're capable of doing. They may not want to do this. And I would also come back to Marco. I mean, the military is the first player that wants control. They have no interest in doing something, fielding something that they cannot control, certainly not. So I'm not only concerned about it, but in comparing different actors, the underground hackers is in a military context what I'm least worried about or less worried about. It's different for law enforcement, obviously.
Thank you very much, Robin. I see that Gloria Gaggioli, the director of the Geneva Academy, also wanted to share.
Thank you, Jacques.
Gloria, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for these excellent presentations and discussion. That's really fascinating. I have a question in relation to the notion of human control that needs to be understood in a dynamic fashion. So I see the advantage of saying that because it renders the notion of human control more palatable to states and to the militaries. At the same time, I'm wondering whether this is a slippery slope, because as soon as we say it's in a dynamic fashion and that controlling the environment is already an element of human control, aren't we actually losing, as if we say that there is a humanitarian perspective behind the notion of humanitarian control? So how are humanitarians losing the battle when they start saying that it's dynamic and we don't know exactly then what are the red lines, what are the limits? Thank you.
Robin?
Yeah, sure. Happy to respond. You're right, Gloria. Good to see you. And so, yes, you're right. I do agree. There is a slippery slope, but it goes in various directions. If I think we stick to like a manual kill switch approach, a very kind of strict definition of what human control should be, we're definitely going to lose the big players. Just, I mean, considering the geopolitical struggles around this technology, many of you will have heard Vladimir Putin say that whoever leads on AI will rule the world. And if you looked at the US report that just came out yesterday, they take exactly that approach. Now, that report was also interest-driven from certain players who will make money with further investments. All of this is, of course, part of the game. But I do think the stakes are high. I do think that big powers will be pushing forward on AI, not necessarily just weapon systems, but militarized AI applications of different types. And I think if we don't pursue a constructive approach that can strike the balance between the humanitarian considerations and perceived military necessities, as we've always done in international law, if we want this to work, if we want this to be realistic, it needs to be constructive. And so, yes, there is the slippery slope, but in most of the rules that we've ever agreed under humanitarian law, there was a slippery slope. There's a slippery slope in proportionality. You can look at it in a very kind of narrow fashion or a broad sense. So that is, I don't think that's new or particularly concerning. It's a common problem that we need to monitor and manage and deal with. And I think, I mean, hopefully we can achieve some common ground around these issues, and that would be the best and most constructive way forward. And therefore, I think a dynamic approach to the formula of what human control can bring, and that it can be different in different contexts, allows for a good balancing decision that's really tailored to the risk involved in given applications.
Thank you very much, Robin. Anyone else wanted to take the floor and make a comment or ask a question? Marco, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to reassure Mrs. Pelayo about those who have most money will win. Well, who wins, the Taliban or the United States? The Taliban have won in Afghanistan, and who has more money? And I think with artificial intelligence, this is even worse. And by the way, the US has used a lot of modern technologies in Afghanistan, and the Taliban have even renounced to portable phones because they know that they can be tracked, and nevertheless they win. And my sympathy to the Taliban is very limited. But just to reassure you, I don't think it's a money issue, and war will remain something like what we have seen. But you are absolutely right that we should not only think about the military, but also about non-state actors, about economic actors, and so on.
If I can complete maybe this comments on the financial aspect, there is a kind of thinking as researchers in university, in IT, we have had some thinking about this in the last 10 years, maybe a bit more, is that while some maybe 20 years ago, the very high level or very advanced research was found in universities, that's probably not yet now the case, in the sense that because of the money they can invest in research and the people, good people they can hire, big tech companies are probably much more advanced than we are. And this is probably even worse, I would say, in the defense department on the military sector, because they probably, or they certainly already invested since many years, and they are much more ahead. Maybe not in every country, but some countries have always heavily invested and are much more ahead than let's say local university or researchers can have. And I think this also is an issue, because then where is this knowledge? It is hidden, let's say, or kept by these companies behind their patents or secrets. It is also kept by the military. It is not shared with the community. So maybe there is also something here to think about. Should we support better the researchers, or how to curb somehow these issues? So that was my little point on that.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. Robin, you wanted to react to?
Yeah, just also to Marco's comment. You know, ostensibly the Taliban used to say, you have the watches, we have the time. And that kind of, I think, encapsulates this economic dimension debate. But I think I would distinguish between future high-tech conflicts and low-tech conflicts. And I think in low-tech conflicts, and I think Afghanistan to a degree was one or is one, with at least one side to the conflict being very low-tech. That's probably true, that the asymmetries are such that money alone cannot help you to achieve your objectives. It can help you win militarily, but not necessarily to achieve the objectives that you really have for a long-term vision. But in high-tech situations, I think it will be difficult and different. I think for high-tech digitalized conflict settings and tensions between big players, I think money will be a big issue. Money also in the sense of who can invest in science, who can drive the technology forward. And that's what's driving our current so-called arms race. I'm not sure it's an arms race. It really is a science and technology race, much more than an arms race. But there, I think money is an important factor.
Thanks very much, Robin. I'm wondering, based on Marco's and your own comment right now, whether we can perhaps not reframe, but also add the dimension of data to which you alluded earlier, Robin, in saying that data is king, so to say, and is highly relevant. So it's not a money issue, it's a data issue, perhaps. It's a data control issue, and my perception also looking at totally unrelated areas is that no matter what type of business you're in, if you are in a position to generate or have access to data and use that for your own activities, you will have the lead at some point. And that's something that I think is also interesting to observe and to see how that can be somehow controlled, or at least take into account in the discussion that we're having now. I don't know whether there are any, I see that time is running, but Jennifer, did you have, because you were saying that you had another question, would you have a short question to ask to the panels? And I see that Rolf Weber also wanted to ask a question, perhaps, so that everyone has an opportunity to speak. Rolf, perhaps Weber first.
Well, thank you very much, Jacques. As a foreigner, I didn't want to intervene, and my question is really very short to Robin. Do you see a chance that we can reach the objective of agreeing on some kind of international standards, harmonized rules, maybe in consequence of the Tallinn efforts which have been taken in the past and which are ongoing with the new version 3.0, or is it a lost hope if we think that we should have some kind of general guidelines for AI and autonomous weapon systems?
Thank you, Rolf. Robin?
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a great and I think crucial question, really. Of course, it involves me reading tea leaves. It's hard to know. I would first maybe draw a distinction. I mean, Tallinn was a huge success and I was involved, so I'm biased in saying this, but it was a huge success also because it built on existing law. And from the start, it didn't pretend that it would be developing something new. But the process has become so important. The developments in the cyber field have become so rapid and large scale that even though Tallinn is based on existing law, clearly it has had to interpret existing law very dynamically, and it has really been helping to drive the debate forward. And I think Tallinn 3.0 will be an important step to the next level now that so many states have positioned themselves, and some with very progressive readings of international law. If you look to the French position, the Netherlands, they've taken fairly progressive, or some would say very progressive positions, which I endorse and agree with. And they will now all be considered as part of the next Tallinn manual exercise. There's also some states who have taken more conservative positions, so it'll be interesting to see how they handle interpretations along those lines. Now, the difference with AI is that I think just by instinctive perception, AI is still considered as something that is even newer, even more exotic than cyber, and therefore needs new rules. And if we're talking about new rules and just considering the current geopolitical environment and what's at stake, new rules is difficult, I think. What we should be trying to do is, as you say, follow the Tallinn approach and start to ground concerns, possible restrictions in existing law for autonomous systems. Maybe not only focus on autonomous weapon systems, but also discuss AI in defense contexts more broadly. I think that'll take some of the pressure off, but it will allow us to focus on similar challenges and problems that are also relevant for the weapons debate. And I think that would be a useful approach. If, as a stepping stone, we first of all need to discuss non-binding principles, ethical principles for AI, then we could do that as well. The problem is, of course, if we only ever keep it in the ethical realm, and we've seen that in civilian debates as well. We have a lot of, ethical principles on AI from all over the place, from the European Union, from China, from the US, ethical principles in abundance. What we don't have so much is principles grounded in existing law, whether it's human rights law in peacetime context or principles grounded in IHL in the future. And I think we need to draw greater attention to what existing law has to say about AI applications. That would probably be a better start. And as I say, I mean, Tallinn started that way and it has become very progressive, I think, in its readings of international law. It's much more up to date and up to speed with the technology today than probably anyone would have ever predicted. A similar approach could also be followed for AI. The discussion about the ban treaty has also been useful. I mean, has produced great knowledge, but also has, of course, increased the stakes for many states and has brought chasms and dividing lines so that some states are no longer maybe fully engaged or hesitant to engage in these debates. And that's problematic. That's why I'm advocating for a more constructive reading also of human control that can help to revive these debates and take them to the next step and level. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Jennifer, opportunity to perhaps ask a question, which would be the last one. No.
There's Andrea Ferraz, and I've already spoken. Thank you for the opportunity, though.
Okay, so who? I don't see. Oh yeah, Andrea Ferraz. Yeah, I see the hands. Please.
Yeah, I just raised my hand now. Thank you so much, Professor Robin and Professor Sassoli, and also Giovanna, for these really interesting explanations and really thought-provoking presentations. I wanted to ask you a question related to something that you mentioned during your presentation on programming, the possibility of programming artificial intelligence using it conservative use of force, which I think would be a great attractive to promote the development of artificial intelligence in warfare. But I wanted to ask you, if I may, if you could develop a bit more how this applying this conservative use of foreign artificial intelligence, because I think that could have some implications in terms of IHL, but also international criminal law, because it would hold accountable differently human soldiers, but artificial intelligence programs. So how would that work? What are the challenges and opportunities that applying different standards to soldiers and artificial intelligence programs would entail? Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the question, Robin.
You know, I'm just mentioning it in a more like kind of conceptual level to show that the problems may not be insurmountable. That's my main point when I say this. I think a lot of states would be opposed to this kind of fragmentation, different sets of rules for different applications. And Marco rightly said, you know, AI systems at the end of the day, they're means of warfare. They're not something special. So if we start working with, you know, fragmented legal regimes, that can create ambiguity as well. So, but from a conceptual kind of point of view, just to say that the autonomy that we grant these systems is not necessarily always an insurmountable challenge. Let's use proportionality as an example. You know, the Ihl principle of proportionality is about collateral damage and limiting collateral damage, which may occur in times of war, to what is proportionate in a given situation. I'm keeping it simple. And the proportionality principle is never, you know, doesn't come with arithmetic precision. It gives you a spectrum of collateral damage that would be tolerable. And then at a rather extreme end, it's quite clear that that would not be tolerable and would be illegal. But there certainly is a margin of discretion that comes with that standard. It is fairly loose, not perfect. Now, if a human being was to apply this standard, we would grant the human being traditionally a certain margin of discretion in the terms of damage that would still be within the realm of what is tolerable. And for an autonomous system, we could say from the start, well, first of all, here is no matter what the circumstances, you get a maximum level of a certain amount of damage that you can wage, but no more. Ever, no matter how drastic the situation is, you can never go above this. And we would draw that line fairly low. And then we would also say, well, if you are considering collateral damage, double check. Or, I mean, if you want full human control, if there's a possibility of collateral damage, revert back to the human commander. That would be the most conservative way. That's full human control. If you don't want that, if you want more autonomy, then you could say, well, if there is the possibility of collateral damage, you must never cause the death of more than 2 people. So no high numbers or anything tolerable when we operate this machine. So we could set clear kind of absolute maximum standards, and very much, I mean, at the lower end of what might be permissible under the law. That's really what I'm saying. So we could carve out a much more conservative reading. Human beings would be allowed much more under wartime conditions. The protective standards are fairly basic. Yeah? We must not forget this. And of course, just to end, what Marco also said, we're discussing all of this under the premise, of course, that war is prohibited and doesn't occur and should not occur. I mean, that's a given. We've just had a very good debate at the Security Council this week about also the erosion, unfortunately, I think, of the use of force prohibition and states relying on self-defense and other states being silent. So, but that's a different debate. And of course, everything we're discussing here comes under that premise that war, of course, is prohibited in the first instance.
Thank you very much, Robin. I certainly don't want to cause any collateral damage in making you late for your next meeting, so I suggest that we shall stop here. Let me thank, first of all, our speaker, Professor Robin Geiss, for this very stimulating presentation and interaction with us. Let me also thank our 2 commentators, Giovanna Di Marzo and Marco Sassoli. Let me also thank, last but certainly not least, Anna Andrievich, with whom I work and with whom I organize this AITPT. Let me also invite you to join for the next session, and I'm sharing that on the chat, and everything is available online This will be a session on a totally different topic, AI decision making in social welfare services. That will be a presentation made by Dr. Sivan Tamir, who is a policy counselor and senior research fellow at the Israel Tech Policy Institute, with which we are in contact. So we hope that you will join us for that session at the end of this month. So this terminates this session. Many thanks to all. And I suggest that the speakers and commentator, as well as Gloria Gajoli, shall join us in the breakout room if you have a few minutes. Many thanks to all, and wishing you an excellent rest of the day. Thank you.